Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing yet another Sharks player review. And this time around, we have Sharks forward Alexander Barabanov. Now, Barabanov's history with the San Jose Sharks is actually relatively short. In fact, his history in the NHL is also quite short, and this isn't because he's, some young rookie 19-year-old, 20-year-old player. No, Barabanov is 27 years old and will be turning 28 within just a few days, but instead he played the start of his career in the KHL and was only brought over to the NHL by the Toronto Maple Leafs last season. However, the Maple Leafs, they're a playoff team and they're relatively deep offensively, so besides a couple games with the Leafs, Barabanov never really found an opportunity to insert himself into the lineup, and so the Maple Leafs GM decided to try and give Barabanov a better chance elsewhere, and the Sharks jumped on that opportunity in what ended up being one of the more lopsided trades of that year's trade deadline, and generally in a decent bit of time. Not on the same scale as, let's say, certain lopsided trades in the past, like the Taylor Hall for Adam Larson trade, where Hall was already regarded to be better than Larson and then ended up getting the Hart Memorial and winning the league's MVP and all of that things. But Barabanov right now is an effective NHL player for the San Jose Sharks. Suomela, on the other hand, continues to just sort of mire around in the AHL, not really doing much of anything. It seemed like a fair trade at the start. Barabanov didn't do much in his few games in the NHL for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Suomela hadn't really played much in the NHL for the Sharks as of late, but in the past had, and in the past also has shown a decent bit of promise. But in the end, Suomela does nothing. Barabanov is really good for the Sharks, so it ends up being one of Doug Wilson's more underrated but effective trades. Now, in that first season, in the 2021 season, they bring him over at the trade deadline. They immediately insert him into the lineup, as you would expect for a team that was pretty weak on the offensive depth type of things, and they play him with Kane and Hertl, and he immediately does very, very well, puts up 9 points in the 9 games to end the season. And so there was definitely some hype with Barabanov. The Sharks decided to bring him back on a 1-year, $1 million sort of prove-it type deal, basically asking him to see what are you going to actually do in a full 82-game season compared to just random 9 games that you played with our 2 best players on the season. And there was so much hype around Barabanov coming into this year that I even made the bold prediction that Barabanov would put up a 50-point season. Now, technically, I would end up being wrong with that prediction if I were to actually have made a bet on one of the many betting sites advertised by the NHL during these playoffs. I would have lost out on some money, but generally I would say I was close enough on this one. In 70 games played, he had 10 goals, 29 assists for 39 points, which if you were to sort of put that over an 82-game season, he would have averaged out at about 46 points, very, very close to that 50-point mark that I did predict from him. And Barabanov was obviously the beneficiary of playing with some effective line mates. At first this season, he ended up playing with Hertl and Balcers on a line for a decent bit of time, and that never really took off. That never really got off the ground. They never really found any sort of chemistry. But later on in the season, Barabanov would be placed with Meier and Hertl, the Sharks' 2 best forwards on the season this year, and he would complement those 2 players very, very well. In fact, Barabanov is kind of just the very prototypical middle 6 forward here for the San Jose Sharks. He's not going to be the player who you can play with Noah Gregor and Scott Reedy and expect him to elevate those 2 players to 30 to 40 point type players. Barabanov is very much a complementary piece that you put with 2 other strong players, and you're not going to bring that line down. You're going to keep it at the same level at the very least, or potentially even go to that next level, because we saw Barabanov, even when playing with Meier and Hertl, he was a decent part of that line. He was not just benefiting from, play drives from Timo Meier or great shots on net from Tomas Hertl or anything like that. Barabanov has some solid stick handling skills. He's got some decent vision to make some nice passes. He scored some pretty clutch goals for the San Jose Sharks as well, so he's got that it factor, you could say. Many will remember that goal against the Vancouver Canucks where he scored in like the last 0.1 seconds of the third period or something along those lines. So Barabanov was definitely still a pretty massive part of the Sharks' first line, and a reason for why it ended up being really the only good line for the San Jose Sharks, or at least the really only consistently good line for the San Jose Sharks over the last quarter to, third of this NHL regular season. Obviously, on a real sort of playoff competitive type of team, Barabanov is probably more of a okay second liner to a really good third liner, but in the situation that the Sharks are, he's certainly not a terrible player to have on your first line, even if it is not optimal for the Sharks situation. Moving on to the rest of his stats, he does sit here at a -5, which really isn't that much of a surprise when you compare it to the other forwards on the team. Like I've said, or I've shown in the past, Timo Meier, I believe, was a -3, and Tomas Hertl was a -5, and so the fact that he has a very, very similar, if not identical, plus minus to his line mates is sort of to be expected, I would say. And when it comes to his time on ice, actually relatively high at 17 minutes and 11 seconds. And you might say, well, is that really all that high? I would say yes, considering the fact that he doesn't actually have any shorthanded ice time incorporated into that. Technically, he has only power play and even strength ice time, and that puts him fourth on the team in terms of time on ice, only behind, of course, the big three of Couture, Meier, and Hertl. He actually is ahead of Nick Bonino by about 20 or so seconds, and Bonino did have a fair amount of shorthanded time, so clearly Barabanov is being leaned on to try and score goals, just not being leaned on to try and prevent them, which isn't necessarily a dock on him at all as a player. It's just not really what he focuses on. Another thing that you could also point to for why maybe his point totals did not end up reaching that 50-point mark is actually his usage indeed on the Sharks power play, because at times the Sharks ended up sort of loading up on their first power play unit. I remember points this season where it was the first power play unit was quarterbacked by both Burns and Carlson, and then it also featured Hertl, Meier, and Couture, basically just the Sharks' 5 best players all on the same power play unit. And so the second power play unit ended up being something like Barabanov with Ferraro, Jasper Weatherby, Jonathan Dahlin. And this is not necessarily a knock on any of those players playing with Barabanov, but like I said, he's very much a complementary piece, and I imagine absolutely if the Sharks spread the love a bit more frequently throughout the season on the Sharks power play units, and so sometimes Barabanov got some chances with Burns, with Hertl, with Meier, that he would have definitely picked up a few more power play points than the 8 he actually had on the season, especially since he actually had a decent amount of power play ice time per game this year. But as we move on to the grade, in the end, I thought it was a pretty good season for Barabanov on the San Jose Sharks, and clearly the Sharks themselves thought the same thing, as he ended up getting re-signed once again at the end of this year on a bit of a discount, you could potentially say. 2 years, $2.5 million for Barabanov, and so he was good enough to get a grade of a B-. Class dismissed.